Hi, I'm Brian Klontz, President of the Emergency Assistance Foundation, and here for part 3 of a 4-part video series on emergency assistance funds for disaster relief and employee hardship. For part 3 of the series, we're going to talk about critical success factors, industry benchmarks, and performance targets. The first is a customized program design that has leadership endorsement, really at the senior level. And the design really takes into account, 1, the grant application process and guidelines, and 2, what the fundraising plan will be throughout the entire company. Second is the funding plan. And that's broad-based, and typically that would involve both employee contributions as well as employer contributions. Very typically would be a matching program, 1-for-1 or 2-for-1 on the employee contributions. Number 3, Engaged Employee Oversight Committee. This is the committee that's typically charged with developing the guidelines and being the internal champions to make sure that the fund is a success. Fourth is a tax-efficient and tax-optimized program. By this we mean that it's fully tax-deductible to any donor and fully tax-free to any grant recipient. Fifth, broad and clear grant guidelines and eligibility, both on the design phase but then also communicated throughout the employee group, both to the donors and to the potential grant recipients. Sixth is operational compliance, both for tax, legal, and regulatory regimes, and to understand that who is responsible within the company to make sure that the program is entirely compliant. Seventh is the grant process and administration, everything from the grant application itself, the communication of the guidelines, the vetting, review, and actually cutting the grant checks in a timely way, which is obviously very critical for any kind of emergency situation. The 8th critical success factor is knowledgeable and passionate staff. Most importantly, to be able to be internal champions, to excite senior leadership, to work cross-departmentally. Typically these in fact involve payroll, benefits, corporate relations and public relations, as well as the corporate foundation, to be that internal champion to make sure that the program is a success. 9th, as I just mentioned, integrating that program with other departments. So it's one thing to be a champion of the program, it's another to have other departments both willing and able and helpful to be able to make sure that every component of the program is well thought out and each person knows their specific role in making sure that the program is a success, again, both from the donation side as well as from the grant side. And 10th is having very clear participation targets, both in terms of the number and percentage of employees contributing, as well as benchmarks around the number of employees that are actually making application for specific personal need. So next we'll talk about the top 12 industry benchmarks and performance targets. So first is total funding, and having at least 50% coming from employees is critical. This is relative to the corporate funding. Interestingly enough, if the corporation funds too much, that actually disincents and disengages employees from participating. So having roughly 50% coming from the corporation directly or through its foundation, and the remaining 50% coming from employees is typically a very strong success factor. Second is participation, having at least 20% of employees contributing to the fund and at least 1% of employees requesting grants. This would be very standard across the industry in terms of the 100+ programs that we've reviewed, that these would be, again, very strong targets for an internal program. Interestingly, JetBlue is a very, very successful employee participation employer where more than 65% of their employees currently contribute to their internal emergency assistance fund. The third industry benchmark and performance target is to have a well-selected and constructed employee oversight committee. Very typically these are 6 to 12 people. Interdepartmental representation is key, as well as senior leadership, mid-management, and lower-level employees to be able to design that program that fits the culture, that fits the funding that the employer group has decided. Fourth, it's ideal for all gifts, contributions to be fully tax deductible and all grants to be tax-free. This can only occur if the employer group is not controlling either the selection of the grantees or the actual legal funding of the grantees. So using a third-party public charity is usually the only way to achieve this specific goal. Fifth, senior leadership endorsing program more with actions than donations. Clearly, having donations from this group is critical, but in fact, in some situations, senior leadership have actually overfunded the program, again, disincenting the employees from participation and engagement. But so having senior leadership saying that the program is a success, is a priority, is key for internal communications. 6, a departmental program integration between employee relations, payroll, public community relations, benefits, and corporate giving is key. Each constituency plays a role in making sure that these programs are successful, and generally without all of them working together, it's very difficult to be able to meet these performance standards and targets. 7th, grant guidelines include both disaster relief, which typically represent about 25% of grant requests over time, and employee hardship, which typically represent about 75% of grant requests over time. Of the roughly 110 programs that we've reviewed, about 3/4 of those usually only have disaster relief as a component, and that is because they are typically employer-controlled public charities or private foundations. Most, if offered the opportunity, would also extend employee hardship grants, because the point is, whether it is a natural disaster or a personal disaster, it's still an employee in need. 8th, that the fund is registered as a charitable solicitor in every state with employees. For state registration and solicitation purposes, there is an initial annual filing, and then there's an ongoing filing to make sure that the public charity is fully compliant with state registration and solicitation laws. And because employees, typically through payroll deduction, are making additional donations, each state where there are employees should actually have full compliance. 9th is a grant process that includes strong due diligence and vetting procedures while balancing that with the need to make grants quickly. In IRS Publication 3833, there are a series of both best practices and mandatory compliance to be able to vet the grant applications appropriately, but at the same time, of course, from a practical perspective, someone whose house just burned down needs to get the money sooner rather than later. So having a well-lubricated system to be able to ensure full compliance, making sure that the grant is being used for the specific qualified need, but being able to get that grant out to the vendor or employee as soon as possible is critical. 10th, grants generally made to vendors directly. So while I just mentioned you can make grants typically to the individuals or to vendors, a best practice is typically to be able to make grants where appropriate to the vendors directly. It certainly eases the additional expenditure responsibility that charities are required to undertake to be able to make sure that the funds were used for the intended purpose. If you're making the grant directly to the utility company, you clearly know it's for utilities versus sending it to the employee and hoping that that's actually where the grant funds actually end up. 11th, for multinational employers in particular, the ability to be able to make international grants to impacted employees. It is key for most multinational employers that this not be seen as a U.S.-only program. These employers are very sensitive to the fact that any benefit in the U.S. is also extended to their other employee groups, and so when an natural disaster occurs overseas, then to be able to have a way to be able to respond to that by using both U.S. and international donations, but be able to make international grants to that person is critical. And 12th, probably last but not least, and perhaps most importantly, robust employee communications through all internal channels, whether that's through the intranet, employee newsletter, verbally, to be able to make these programs a priority and communicating the opportunity through the benefits and HR process to be able to participate through payroll deduction, through the annual campaign process, both for United Way and then adding this as a potential additional option, and then most importantly, to make sure that employees understand the process and the guidelines to be able to request specific personal assistance. What you'll see here are some additional resources that might be helpful as you're exploring creating or enhancing your emergency assistance fund. But also I hope that this has given you a good summary of the critical success factors, the industry benchmarks, and performance targets for a successful fund.